Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and today is episode 6 of my series, The Mexican-American War, Vera Cruz, and Polkas. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, President James Polk had received permission to declare war on Mexico after a disturbingly brief debate in Congress. While American preoccupation with a war against its southern neighbor gave Britain an advantage in the dispute over Oregon Territory, the British government decided that the 49th parallel was a fair border and signed a treaty. Actually, the war had already started, and the superiority of American artillery enabled General Taylor to defeat a Mexican army under General Arista. Soon after the battle, President Paredes resigned. Aside from anger at the defeat, the main factor was popular opposition to his increasingly open support for a return to monarchy. Strange as it may sound, he was succeeded by Santa Anna, who had been allowed to pass through the American blockade because Polk believed that he would negotiate the annexation of Texas. Polk was immediately proven wrong. At the same time, Taylor had driven General Ampudia out of Monterrey, a key city in northern Mexico. Ampudia marched his men to San Luis Potosi, where Santa Anna was training a new army in the expectation that Taylor would continue to advance into Mexico. However, he soon learned that Taylor would lose some of his army to reinforce a planned American invasion of Vera Cruz. Even though he lacked enough supplies and the men were not fully trained, Santa Anna still decided to march his army north to hopefully drive Taylor back to Texas. The march was expected to be grueling, but they had the bad luck to march during the worst winter the region had experienced in decades. Thousands of soldiers either died or deserted. It is important to point out that Santa Anna could have simply waited for the exhausted American army to arrive. Instead, he forced his badly supplied troops to bear the hardship of crossing harsh terrain. Once again, Santa Anna had to go on the offensive in search of glory, rather than fight a defensive war. To be honest, while Polk received well-deserved criticism for trusting that Santa Anna would keep his bargain and negotiate a peace, the decision to allow him to Mexico benefited the Americans, since he was a much better plotter than general. The American volunteers had accepted that the risk of death was the price of glory, but they discovered that death from disease was far more likely than death in battle. 7 times as many men were killed by illness than battle, killed by malaria, smallpox, cholera, yellow fever, and dysentery. While this suffering would be expected when troops were on the march, many deaths occurred in the camps near the Rio Grande when Taylor left the volunteers behind as he advanced into Mexico. This sounds strange, but he had quickly realized that they would be difficult, if not impossible, to train. Packed together in a camp with a poor location and a bad water supply, Camargo soon became a graveyard. A key issue was that regulars accepted, or had beaten into them, the need to maintain clean, orderly camps, while the volunteers had come in search of glory, not menial labor digging latrines. So disease took a heavy toll. 1,500 men died at Camargo, 1 out of every 8. Aside from disease, there was another danger, namely Mexican guerrillas. The residents of northern Mexico had been battling Comanche raiders for decades. Groups of neighbors would gather together to pursue the raiding parties. Both sides tortured and killed captives, so locals simply drew on their usual methods when faced with invading Americans. Actually, the initial arrival of regular troops was received well, since the locals were understandably frustrated with a distant government that demanded taxes but provided no protection. The American army paid for supplies, and American occupation offered improved access to American markets. Then the volunteers arrived. Unlike the regulars, who were disciplined, busy with work, and often fellow Catholics, the volunteers were undisciplined, filled with both free time and a thirst for adventure, and were Protestants who viewed the churches as alien. Bored and often drunk, they killed cattle to supplement their rations, stole corn, and used fences for firewood. Some volunteers even raped local women. Realizing that the American army could not control the volunteers, the locals began to view the volunteers as Comanche with different skin pigmentation and hunted them whenever they were in small groups or alone, killing them and leaving mutilated bodies behind as a warning. These tactics shocked the regular Mexican officers, but they were equally unable to control the guerrillas. The brutal guerrilla warfare provoked an equally brutal response from the volunteers. They had expected a traditional war with the occasional battle that would last a few hours or a couple of days. Instead, they found themselves viewed as occupiers in a foreign land, always in danger, never sure who they could trust, so the relentless pressure probably wore them down. The cycle of violence escalated until February 13th, when a group of Arkansas volunteers avenged the death of a fellow volunteer by murdering roughly 25 men at Agua Neva, and only stopped because a group of Illinois volunteers protected the rest. Their commander was Archibald Yell, a former governor of Arkansas, and he refused to discipline them. The exact details are not clear, but 6 different volunteers related their memories of the incident. Both Taylor and his second-in-command, General John Wool, were appalled and refused to believe that the massacre was justified. The Arkansas volunteers were the most troublesome, and when the Arkansas men refused to identify the killers, Taylor ordered the troops involved in the massacre to return to the camps on the Rio Grande, where, as I have explained, death by disease was very likely. He even wrote a letter that harshly criticized the volunteers, which was read out loud in the camp. However, Taylor canceled the transfer order when he learned that a large Mexican army was on its way. Aware that he was outnumbered, Taylor retreated to Buena Vista, which had better natural defenses. Still, Taylor had problems since most of his troops were inexperienced volunteer regiments. The main battle started on February 23rd, and an early skirmish saw Arkansas volunteers flee in panic, which encouraged Santa Anna to attack right away rather than rest his men after the harsh march. At one point, volunteer troops from Illinois and Kentucky broke and ran, but American artillery stopped the Mexican advance. Actually, American artillery was decisive, and the Mexican troops were badly led and exhausted, so they could not take advantage of any opportunities. Even so, General Wool told Taylor, "General, we are whipped." Taylor responded, "That is for me to determine." And he used Mississippi volunteers led by Jefferson Davis to plug a hole in the line. The Mexicans could not break through the superior American artillery, but the Americans could not break through the Mexican lines. The day ended in a bloody draw, and the Americans were not sure they could survive a second day of fighting. However, there would not be a second day of fighting. Large numbers of Mexican soldiers had deserted because there was not enough food, so Santa Anna decided to march back to San Luis Potosi, even though the march from the state had nearly broken his army. Santa Anna's callous neglect of his troops sparked a huge number of desertions. While Taylor expressed pride in his victory, he had no desire to pursue the Mexican army. Instead, he retreated to the safety of Monterrey. The Americans took 700 casualties, including Yell and Henry Clay's son, but Santa Anna had suffered worse casualties of 3,500. American newspapers reported the deaths of the officers as stirring examples of noble chivalry, ignoring the fact that they were shot by nameless Mexican soldiers defending their land. News of the victory sparked massive patriotic celebrations in the United States. Then the casualty lists began to arrive. Aside from deaths in battle or from disease, over 9,000 American soldiers had deserted by March 1847. But many were volunteers who decided that they had done their share and went home. Others sought a new life in the Indian Territory or California, so only a minority actually enlisted in the Mexican army. Despite the numerous American victories, it was clear that it would not be a short, easy war. The only solution would be a campaign against Mexico City to bring the war to an end, or an offer to leave Mexico in exchange for official acceptance of the annexation of Texas, New Mexico, and California. Around the same time as the Battle of Buena Vista, the 10 Regiments Bill made its way through Congress. While the bill was intended to increase the size of the army, Polk also hoped to create a Democrat war hero. 2 new major generals and 4 more brigadier generals would be appointed. Obviously, the second major general would be Taylor, but Senator Hart Benton might be the third. And if he was appointed to command the army in Mexico, then he would be the hero, not Taylor or Winfield Scott. The 10 Regiments Bill passed the House easily on January 11th, but stalled in the Senate until it passed on January 30th. The delay must have been stressful and reminded Polk that he had little power over the party. Although Polk had accomplished his goals and was about to greatly increase the size of the United States, he was losing control of his party, so he had trouble getting any bill through Congress. This weakness was confirmed on February 8th when the John Calhoun faction of the Democrats allied with the Whigs to try to stop the 10 Regiments Bill, also called the $3 million bill because Polk had asked for $3 million. Calhoun called for the president to cancel the invasion of Vera Cruz. Instead, the United States should focus on defending the lands that it had taken, including New Mexico and California, and wait for the Mexican government to ask for peace, thus avoiding the waste of more money and men. Senator Lewis Cass responded with the argument that it would be impossible to defend such a long border, so it would be simpler to invade the capital and force the Mexicans to accept peace, which ended that debate. However, Calhoun was not the only unsatisfied member of the Democrats. David Wilmot of Pennsylvania was part of the Van Buren wing of the Democrats. Anti-slavery Democrats from the northern states, they had been excluded from both the cabinet and any patronage, so they had little interest in supporting Polk. Wilmot had proposed an amendment to a previous bill that would ban slavery from any territory acquired from the Republic of Mexico. The proviso had failed to gain enough support, but it was reintroduced on February 15th, and it proved to have real cross-party support, although almost all of the supporters were based in the North. Wilmot framed his proviso as defending the white working class. His intention was to preserve for white people a fair country, a rich inheritance where the sons of toil of my own race and own color can live without the disgrace which association with Negro slavery brings upon free labor. The proviso is the best example of the link between Northern opposition to the war and opposition to slavery. There were other debates because the senators liked to make speeches, but the proviso failed by 5 votes, while the $3 million bill passed at the end of the session on March 3rd by a solid margin. Still, Congress refused to create the rank of lieutenant general, so Polk had failed to transform Senator Benton into a war hero for the Democratic Party. Honestly, it is bizarre that Polk wanted to appoint Benton as a general, since his only military experience was as an aide to Andrew Jackson during the War of 1812, where he represented Jackson in Washington. It does not receive enough attention, but the American blockade of Mexico was decisive. Mexico's government already struggled to collect enough tax revenue to provide basic services, and much of that revenue came from customs duties. But roughly half of the government's revenue disappeared after the American Navy blockaded the main Mexican ports. As a result, Mexican armies could not pay their soldiers, and they could not pay locals for food or labor, while the Americans were able to pay their troops fairly regularly and could pay locals for food and labor. This was a crucial factor in the Mexican defeats. Hungry soldiers were more likely to desert. Moreover, Mexico did not have its own arms industry, so it was dependent on imports for weapons and, more crucially, ammunition. Aside from the blockade, domestic conflict made it harder to resist the invasion. Like the militia in the United States, Mexico had its National Guard, units of citizen soldiers who were recruited from the same region or the same professions. Since the members of these part-time units shared the same political leanings, the various political factions had armed supporters. Despite the potential for factional violence, the nation was united against a foreign invader, until the federal government tried to force the Catholic Church to give even more than it had. The Church had been relatively generous because Mexico had been invaded by a Protestant army that had contempt and sometimes hatred of the Catholic Church. However, the fiscal situation was dire, so on January 11th, 1847, Congress authorized the government to raise the huge sum of 15 million pesos from the sale of property owned by the church. Even though he was aware that it was controversial, Santa Anna approved of the law. The law was not thought out carefully. The advocates of the bill thought that the church was wealthy, which it was, and that the wealth could be easily converted into cash, which it could not. The obvious question is, who in Mexico, other than the church, had the wealth to purchase its properties for cash, not a mortgage with long-term payments? The Catholic Church in Mexico was not a monolith, but most clergy supported the war against the Americans, who were viewed as a direct threat to the religious mission of the church. Even if the American government did not outlaw the Catholic Church if it won, it would undoubtedly demand that Protestant churches be permitted to compete with the Catholic Church for believers. Catholic clergy preached resistance. The church had given generous loans that exceeded their regular income from rents of property, and many churches had donated their bells to be melted down for bullets or cannon. The law confiscating church assets became part of a larger issue involving the debate between centralism and federalism. The adoption of a federalist government had greatly expanded suffrage, promoting a sense of egalitarianism that offended the wealthy who had worked to limit suffrage in the previous government. Election campaigns became more lively, and the rhetoric was often critical of the elite. In response, the wealthy organized National Guard units in Mexico City to protect their interests and their property against any riots. So the passage of the law was simply the spark that lit a growing class conflict. Even so, these small units would have never dared to launch a coup. Except, the vast majority of the regular army was busy fighting a war. The law passed on January 11th, but the final spark occurred on February 25th when the government decided to eliminate the threat of conservative units by ordering them to march to Vera Cruz, which would have exposed them to the rampant disease the region was infamous for, and abandon their property and families to the more radical units that would remain behind. The church confiscation law simply gave them a cause. The coup did not immediately succeed since the conservatives and the radical units proved evenly matched. The upper-class rebels enjoyed dancing the polkas, which were popular at the time, so it was called the Revolt of the Polkas. They were also supported by the church, which was tired of being squeezed for donations to fund the army. Neither side could win, so the Polkas issued a simpler demand on March 8th calling for the removal of Gómez Farías as vice president. When a group of moderates called for Santa Anna to return to the capital, he accepted. Arriving on March 21st, there were several days of negotiations between the factions until the church donated millions of pesos, far less than the original amount, but still considerable, and Santa Anna agreed to replace Gómez Farías with the moderate General Anaya as acting president. In the end, this is why the United States was winning the war. The political leaders bickered and fought each other instead of at least pretending to cooperate against a foreign invader. It is important to stress that the Polka revolt occurred just when Scott invaded Vera Cruz. To sum up, driven by a desire for glory, Santa Anna led his army on a grueling march to attack Taylor at Buena Vista, where he was defeated after a bloody battle. The situation in Mexico was grim, but it became worse when militia units made up of members of the upper class revolted. The coup attempt failed, but it distracted the government just as Winfield Scott prepared to attack Vera Cruz. Before I talk about Vera Cruz, I need to explain what had been happening in New Mexico and California, which I will discuss next episode. Thanks for listening.